For women of a certain age, lockdown has really destroyed their chances to start a family. Whether it's 2 years where dating was off limits or the doors of fertility clinics being slammed shut, government policy has wiped out the possibility for countless women to become mothers. And very few seem to care. However, the Pope the other day called upon women to crack on with having kids, calling them selfish and asking them to help thaw the West's demographic winter. Well, perhaps cash in on some of that Vatican gold to fund childcare or use papal power to tell men to step up and be responsible fathers. The latest UK chapter in Clapping for the Not Your Health Service sees that all fertility treatments blocked for unvaccinated women in Scotland. Joining us on the show now is psychologist Emma Kenny, who's been through IVF and consultant embryologist and clinical director at IVF London, Alpesh Doshi, and microbiologist Andrew Preston from the University of Bath. Emma, first of all, tell me about your IVF experience.
Yeah, I mean, both my boys have fertility treatment and then IVF I've had many times and failed, unfortunately. Really very emotional, obviously. Obviously, it's very expensive as well for some people, but fortunately, I have got 2 children. But for many women out there, as you said, who maybe have had a couple of years where they've not been able to access fertility treatment, or for those who now want to have it but don't want to have a vaccine, to have that vetoed is just soul destroying. And also it's coercion. And in spite of the fact that we know that there are reasons why you shouldn't be making anybody have something done to their body they don't want to have done, it seems to be in Scotland that they're making this policy. And that for me is not just detrimental to the women themselves and the wider families, it's actually detrimental to our society, because we are all individuals unique of thought, and some of us will agree and some of us will disagree. And we don't want to put people into a manufactured state of mind where they have to do things according to the state, because essentially that removes their freedom of autonomy. We want to create individuals who are unique in our societies, who grow into independent thinkers, and that's being stolen from us at the moment. So my experience of IBS is traumatizing, often unfulfilling, but obviously something that's very important, because to have children, as far as I'm concerned, both psychologically and obviously as a professional as well, is something that's deeply fulfilling and gives you a sense of purpose and meaning that I think is unlike any other.
Now, I'm going to come to you next, Alpesh. Is this something that you agree with, that if women haven't been vaccinated, then it's fine to say you can't have fertility treatment, or do you think that's completely illogical or immoral?
I think it's very important to understand that everyone does reserve the freedom of choice. And certainly, in my opinion, and in the UK, in London especially, we are not creating any boundaries around treatment when it comes to vaccinated or unvaccinated candidates. However, as a clinic, we do test patients for COVID-19 right at the beginning of treatment and midway through treatment. And as a responsible clinic, we have to sometimes terminate treatment if patients do become positive in their journey of fertility treatment, in safety to staff and their other fellow patients.
Andrew, a good friend of the show, is there any sort of, when it comes to microbiology and virology, is there any sense behind what Scotland have done, do you think, in saying that if you're not fully vaccinated, you can't have IVF?
I'm not sure exactly what the motivation for this step is. Clearly, vaccination is the most protective mechanism we have against COVID itself. And yes, there is data that suggests, particularly in the third trimester, that women who have COVID are more susceptible to certain complications, so premature birth and preeclampsia in those later stages. But again, to have it even as a requirement for the very start of that journey, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities to then counsel ladies who eventually become pregnant about the choice of the vaccines. And certainly it's not mandatory that once you're pregnant, you have to have the vaccine. So again, I think it'd be really interesting to know exactly what the rationale for saying that even to start IVF, you must be vaccinated.
I'm going to come back to you, Emma. If someone is going through IVF or is desperately trying to get pregnant, it might be that a lot of women out there think, well, we haven't had any long-term evidence on the impacts of vaccination, and therefore they might think they're doing something and erring on the side of caution.
I mean, what is risk assessment these days? What happened to risk assessment? I mean, there are so many things coming out that we know weren't properly risk assessed, like the impact on poverty, children in schools wearing masks. All these things weren't risk assessed, and we know now they're having catastrophic impacts. aside from the impact on our planet. So when it comes down to long-term studies, it doesn't matter what people tell you about safety. And I'm sure that for the long term, it'll turn out that the vaccine isn't some catastrophic annihilator of human beings. I genuinely believe that. But don't tell me you know they're safe unless you have a time machine that's 20 years down the line, in which case I will beg to your professional conduct and knowledge. Right now, for women who don't want to, at this point, have that vaccine because they're young enough and fit enough, because obviously vulnerable and people who are very overweight and these kind of things, that's a chance you have to take, really, because there are things that could mean that it was potentially good for you to have the vaccine. But as a young, fit, healthy woman or a middle-aged, fit, healthy woman, if you don't want to have that put in your body, rightfully so, because let's draw our attention to how very few decades we've had control over our bodies. You know, we're talking the 1960s when we were given the opportunity to protect ourselves from getting pregnant through medication. Also, we've been able to have abortions now since the 60s. The truth is, women lost their autonomy forever, it seems, until very recently. I'm not going to hand over my autonomy, and neither should anybody else, based on somebody telling me this is safe, even though I haven't got a actual evidence in 20 years that it is. I hope it is. But if you don't feel it is, that's fine. And I don't know what's happening in Scotland. They have had some issues, actually. There's some research out saying that there is an issue with children dying early on, in the first few weeks of birth. And these are being investigated now because there's been a spike in those things. There's also been an issue with bears in America, saying that there are lots of children who, during gestation, babies have died.
I'm going to have to jump in there because we've got to sort of play by the rules and make sure when things haven't been verified that I sort of flag that up. I'm going to quickly ask you, Alpesh, given that the last 2 years have been hugely disruptive for people seeking fertility treatment, do you think to compensate that cut-off points for things like IVF, age cut-off points, should be extended to actually, compensate for that?
That's a very good question. Certainly, our regulators have recommended that we increase the storage limit for some of these patients who've been not been able to have treatment with regards to their stored embryos. Now, going back to the safety of the vaccines, I think women are really entitled to make an informed decision about the vaccine. However, how do you make an informed decision? And I feel that it is very important to ensure that women look at professional body guidelines. There's three main professional bodies that I'm talking about. One, which is the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the UK. Secondly, which is the European Society for Human Reproduction and Embryology. And thirdly, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. All of these professional bodies have unequivocally said that, of course, there is no long-term follow-up, but the short-term data is that it's protective and there is no lethal implication of the vaccine. And as my colleague said, in the third trimester, we really need to be careful because
I'm afraid I'm going to have to call our heated conversation to a close there, but thank you all three for joining me. I really appreciate your contribution. Now, we do have a statement from NHS England who says, we want to make it clear that NHS England's position remains that vaccination status is not an eligibility criterion for access to IVF. It looks as though there have been reports of a change in Scotland, though, which has been reported in the last few days. The change is not replicated in England.